Hello and welcome to a very special 35th episode of Jazzology. I am your one-time only host, Adam Savage, one of the savages behind Savage Content. Now, longtime viewers may be asking yourself, what is going on? Why aren't there any contestants in the thumbnail? Where is Willard? Don't worry. The show will be back to normal in the next episode in 2 weeks as returning champion Nathan Holloway looks to extend his all-time win streak. But for this episode, we wanted to do a very special interview because our guest today was just named the recipient of the 2024 A.B. Spellman NEA Jazz Masters Fellowship for Advocacy. They are a journalist, radio host, editor and compiler of the book Ain't But a Few of Us, and most importantly, host of Jazzology with Willard Jenkins. Please welcome our very own Willard Jenkins.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure to be here, Adam.
Well, Willard, it is such an honor to get to talk to you and to kind of play interviewer with you. I know you are a master interviewer, so, excuse me if I don't have all of your skills. But we're glad to be doing this special kind of experimental episode today. But before we get started, we want to get a few things out of the way so we just can go with the flow for the rest of the show. So first up is we just don't know how long this episode is going to be. It could be a little shorter than normal. If so, forgive us. Or it could be a little on the long side. So if we get to 45 minutes, we'll just try and make ourselves wrap up. But before we get too far into the conversation, we also want to take a minute to talk about the latest project from Savage Content. We are so proud to announce our partnership with the Boundless Arts Foundation, as they have selected Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and Music Hall in downtown Cincinnati for the filming and live recording of a new large-scale multimedia and multidisciplinary presentation of composer Justin Morel's Jazz Trumpet Concerto, All Without Words Live, on September 20th, 2023. Composed as a tribute to Morel's nonverbal autistic son, Lauren Morel, All Without Words Live was inspired by Lauren's spontaneous vocalizations and evolved into a work for solo trumpet, orchestra, rhythm section, and chorus. The presentation will be the world premiere of an experience that embraces staging, light, color, and multiple artistic disciplines. The CSO presentation will include the addition of dancers as well as a gallery of art exhibits by artists from the art of autism. The entire audience experience, including foyer activations and performances in Cincinnati Music Hall's Springer Auditorium, will be filmed. Additional details are available at awwlive.com. And be sure to follow the project at All Without Words on all social media. Remember to get your tickets today if you can join us on September 20th at Cincinnati Music Hall. Now, before we continue on, remember to follow the show at Jazzology Trivia Show on social media. And be sure to follow Savage Content on social media at Savage CNTNT. And if you're watching us on YouTube, as you have to be, unless this is a clip on social media, be sure to give us a subscribe, a like, a follow, all the good social media, all the good YouTube stuff you see there. Now, we can get on with the actual show. So, Willard, I'm going to start at the beginning. While you were born in Pittsburgh, you were raised in Cleveland. What was growing up in Cleveland like?
Oh, growing up in Cleveland was great. I went to John F. Kennedy High School. I was actually in the second graduating class for John F. Kennedy High School. I guess that really dates me. But we lived in an area that was known as Mount Pleasant in Cleveland. And growing up in Cleveland was great. It certainly nurtured my interest in this music we call jazz.
And so you grew up kind of listening to jazz in your through your parents and stuff. That's how you discovered the music?
Well, yeah, it was my father's record collection
Hmm.
was my primary point of discovery. I can remember one year, one Christmas, my father got one of those. Everybody of a certain age remembers those big old consoles that people used to have in their living rooms. That had you open a big lid at the top, and there was a turntable and a radio and the various systems there, and it also had room for records as well. My father had a pretty decent record collection, and I suppose just listening to him play the records got me interested. And there was also a what is now a extremely rare bird, but in Cleveland at the time there was a 24-hour jazz radio station on FM radio,
Hmm.
known as WCUY. CUY being for Cuyahoga. Cuyahoga County is where Cleveland is located. And so anyway, hearing my father play the radio station and the various records he played, certain things would catch my ear, and I would further investigate by reading the notes on those records because we're talking about LPs,
Hmm.
and this was well before CDs, well before cassettes even, and so I'm reading the notes on these various records, and there was a lot of interest in finding out the background behind those records and those artists. And invariably, you would listen to a recording and say it was a recording that was led by the piano player. And you're listening to the recording, you begun to enjoy this particular piano player, but then you listen and there's someone else in the band who really strikes your interest. Like I really like what that saxophone player is doing, or I really like what that bass player is doing, or whatever. And so that I started going to record stores, looking at looking through the stacks, and invariably I would find myself looking for some of those people I heard as side persons on those various recordings that I was enjoying at my father from my father's record collection. So that was a way to expand my knowledge was through those records and finding out who was who and who was doing what, and then going to the record store and looking for more recordings by those people. So it just grew from there.
Hmm. Well, and you kind of were touching on something I was going to ask you about a little bit is how discovery and learning about the music has changed, from when you were growing up to today. Because I know, like, even when I was growing up, you would get into something, whether it was music or some other part of pop culture, and you would get really interested in it. And you would sometimes there would be stuff you'd only ever hear about because
Hmm.
you couldn't get copies of it, or you get weird sources to learn more about it, especially if it was a less mainstream kind of thing. Whereas today, it's kind of easy to, even if it's a niche thing you're into, you just type it into the internet and you can find all the stuff. So I was going to ask you, what it was like trying to learn more about jazz, and if there was any records or any musicians where you heard rumblings about them, but it took you a long time to actually be able to hear examples of it.
Well, you're right. We now have a wealth of resources to find out these various things. For example, if you hear somebody that you're really interested in, you can immediately go to the net and pull up all kinds of information, much more broadly than was available to us at the time from reading those liner notes and reading the magazines. Because after a while, I started checking out the jazz magazines like Downbeat magazine, for example. Um, but it was a different time in life, and you found your information in different ways, you know. You talk, like I mentioned how important it was discovering various artists and various recordings at record stores, and we don't have record stores like we used to have.
Yeah.
So there's such a vast universe of information now available that you can find out these
Mhm.
things. It's just a matter of piquing your own curiosity in terms of the kinds of things that you want to learn, because that information is available. But back then it was an analog world. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's like I remember growing up, because you only had so much of your own funds. So, my own personal music collection could only get so big.
Right.
So, and, yes, it was CDs by then, but, if you got a CD, you listen to it over and over again in a way I don't think we do necessarily with MP3s or streaming services, at least as much. So I was going to ask you, can you remember your favorite album or a couple favorite albums from when you were growing up that you got them and just listened to them over and over and almost wore them out?
Well, it's a funny thing because back then it was back when I was first learning about the music and informing myself educating myself about the music. Back then, it was a growing phenomenon where people even had stereo systems in their homes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was unusual to a certain extent. But as far as certain records that really caught my interest, I mentioned the fact that the whole aspect of having home entertainment systems, home stereo systems, was new, and it was growing at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And it was growing, and the manufacturers, when you would go to a showroom to purchase some kind of stereo equipment or some kind of playback equipment for your home, they would often have these demonstration recordings. And sometimes those demonstration recordings, they at the time there was really this wanting to explore the universe of stereophonic sound. It was such a new thing,
Mm-hmm.
where you were directed to sit, equidistant in between the speakers in order to get the proper effect and those kinds of things. And they would have these demo recordings at the stores that you could use to demonstrate this, that they could use to demonstrate the glories of stereophonic sound. And sometimes those demonstration recordings would be compilations of recordings from the various record labels. And my father had a few of those compilations. The one that I can really remember was from a label called Argo Jazz, which was a subsidiary of Chess Records. And we all think of Chess Records as one of the places that really helped to promote the rhythm and blues sound.
Mm-hmm.
But the Chess Records also had an Argo Records subsidiary, which was their jazz subsidiary. So Argo Records put out a sampler, and my father had this sampler, and it was a compilation of artists, compilation of their recordings. And I remember becoming enthralled with several pieces of music on that compilation. For example, Argo put out a recording by the late great tenor saxophonist James Moody, where James Moody was playing with strings. And back then that was high culture for jazz musicians to make recordings with strings. And so I became enthralled with hearing those various tracks. And then I'd look on the back of the recording, and there was this guy named Roland Kirk. And it turned out that he was from Columbus, Ohio. And there was a connection there because I partly grew up in Columbus. It's where my paternal grandparents were in Columbus. So we went to Columbus all the time. My grandfather was a Baptist minister. And so we went to Columbus all the time. And so the fact that this guy, Roland Kirk, was from Columbus, that was intriguing to begin with. And then I learned, as I read, oh, this guy is blind. So this is a handicapped musician. And not only was he a great musician, but this is a guy who was known for playing 2 or 3 saxophones at the same time, and for all these wonderful musical feats. So, I became interested in him. So, began to look for his recordings. And so those samplers really gave you a sense of other artists on the scene. Another artist who was on that compilation was the late great, he passed a few weeks ago, now late great pianist and composer Ahmad Jamal. And Ahmad Jamal was someone who I felt a connection to as well because he was from Pittsburgh. And so he was on that compilation. So I started checking out what he was doing and his various recordings. And so, those kinds of compilations really helped to stimulate my interest and knowledge of various artists who really reached my ears, shall we say.
Awesome. Well, we've been talking about your early life. You mentioned you were the second ever graduating class from JFK High School in Cleveland. From there, you went on to Kent State. So you were there at a bit of a historical time, at least around the time when you first got there. So we'll go back to more jazz related stuff, but I figured I'd ask you, what was it like being at Kent State at the time of the Kent State shootings?
Well, Kent State is a place that has had a history of student protest. And spurred by that momentous occasion on May 4th, 1970, when those 4 students were murdered by the National Guard, from protests, from a whole weekend of protests over the bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. That university, that great university, a very important place to me, Kent State University. The university has subsequently developed a remembrance center based upon the actions of May 4th. But when I visited the Remembrance Center, the May 4th Remembrance Center, I was shocked and delighted when I opened the door that there are all these photographs lining the walls. And almost immediately when I opened the door, I saw a photograph of myself as part of student protests. So not only is it commemorating May 4th, 1970, but this Remembrance Center also commemorates, to me, the history of student protests at Kent State University. Kent State was a very political place, but it was also, for me, as far as the music is concerned, it was a place where my interest in the music really blossomed, because now I'm away from home and I don't have my father's record collection, but I still want to hear the music. I'm still interested in it. My interest is still growing in the music. So I started developing my own collection. And after a while, I became kind of a go-to guy. I was the guy with a big record collection. And so for example, and it went beyond jazz, because, for example, I was very much into Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone. And I was the first guy on campus who had the very first Earth, Wind and Fire record, which was on Warner Brothers Records. And so people knew that I was a record guy, and I had this big collection. And at a certain point, I got my own stereo system for my dorm room and eventually for my apartment, and started really hitting the record stores in Kent to build my own record collection. But that was during a time, Adam, where unlike today, where records are released nationally, the record companies kind of rolled out new releases regionally. So they would go to the larger regions and the larger communities first before they trickled down to a smaller community like Kent, Ohio. So, for example, the new recordings would come out in Cleveland before we get them down in Kent. So I didn't have a car at the time, at the beginning. So I would commandeer a car, like girlfriends or whatever, commandeer cars and drive to Cleveland to get the latest release before anybody else had it. And that for example, was was part of my discovery of the greatness of Miles Davis.
Yeah.
And I ran the Cleveland when Miles Davis' classic record "Bitches Brew" came out. I commandeered somebody's car so I could drive up to Cleveland and get it before anybody else in Kent had it. So that was the Kent State experience, and it was at Kent State. And going back to the whole aspect of Kent State being a very political place, what some people don't recognize is the fact that the year prior to the incident, in the horrific incident of May 4th, 1970, when those students were killed, the year prior to that, the Black students at Kent had a big protest, and I was there at the time and was a part of that. And part of that, the upshot of that protest was that we developed a Black student newspaper called Black Watch. And that became the first place that I was able to actually write about jazz. So that was the beginning of my whole jazz journalism aspect. And I was a guy who always, I was one of those odd students who better appreciated essay exams over multiple choice exams. If I had an essay exam, I was good because I knew I could finesse my way through that. You can't finesse your way through multiple choice. Essay exam, and so then I realized I had an ability to write, and so that became a way for me to express myself about my growing interest in and love of jazz music and music in general, was to write about it for one of the student newspapers. So that was the beginning of that.
Awesome. And so you decided to pursue that as you got ready to leave school.
Yeah, backing up to my father. My father was a newspaper man. My father was actually part of the first generation of African American professionals working at newspapers, and I emphasize professionals because my father was a college graduate. I was always proud of the fact that both my parents were college graduates, and my father was a college graduate, and so he was part of this first generation of African American professionals working at daily newspapers. So he worked at the daily newspaper in Pittsburgh. And he worked at what was the former Sun Telegraph, and the Sun Telegraph was purchased by the other daily. That was back in the days when towns had a morning and an afternoon daily newspaper, and so the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which was the morning paper, they bought out the Sun Telegraph where my father worked. And my father was a typographer, and he was a member of the Typographers Union. He was a staunch union guy, and the Typographers Union was a strong union. And when the Sun Telegraph was bought out by the Post Gazette, the union enabled all of the Sun Telegraph workers to have other opportunities at other newspapers around the country. And my father had some history in Cleveland, so he chose for us to relocate to Cleveland. And so he began working at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And when I graduated from Kent, since my father had some in at the Plain Dealer, he introduced me to a man named Robert Roach, who was the editor of the Friday Entertainment Supplement. Most of the big daily newspapers always published a Friday entertainment supplement. And at the Plain Dealer, it was called the Friday Magazine. And so my father introduced me to the editor, and the editor brought me on to write for the Friday magazines. That's how I started writing for a daily newspaper, was writing for the Friday magazine. And believe it or not, that there were actually two of us, two jazz writers at the Friday magazine, and the other was a man named Chris Columbi, who was actually a DJ at that radio station I mentioned, that 24-hour, long gone 24-hour jazz
Yeah.
radio station. And so he wrote record reviews. So Bob Roach wanted me to write previews. So what I would do is contribute previews of jazz concerts and activities coming up in the area in the coming days. And so that's how I got started writing newspaper writing.
And becoming a professional, in the newspaper world and in the jazz world, what was that like versus what you imagined it would be like?
I had no preconceived notions of what that would be like.
Mm-hmm.
It was great because suddenly I got access, and I had actually begun to get access as a student writing for the Black Watch student newspaper at Kent State. I started writing for the Black Watch, and then all of a sudden, from out of nowhere, record companies started sending me promotional copies of records to review. And so I'm like, oh, free records? My goodness, this is a way to get free records. So that opened up another avenue. And there was also a great club, a jazz club in Cleveland called the Smiling Dog Saloon. That was where I saw many people for the first time, where I saw Miles Davis for the first time, where I saw Herbie Hancock a lot of people, where I saw the original Chick Corea Return to Forever, where I saw the original Weather Report, was at this place, the Smiling Dog Saloon. And we would drive there on the weekends to catch some sets. And they began to comp me, to let me in free as a journalist. So I was like, wow, I can get records and I can go to gigs as a media person. So that just expanded at the Plain Dealer, because at the Plain Dealer now I have the force of Ohio's largest daily newspaper behind me, as far as gaining access to records I was interested in, or to going to performances and whatnot. And things just spiraled from there in a very positive way.
And so you just knew you wanted to do something like this. You didn't have any grand ambitions for what you wanted your career to be?
No, I actually, I got a degree in sociology, and I got a job working for the Ohio Adult Parole Authority, postgraduate. It's funny because I busted my hump to get out to graduate when I did, and I actually took 20 hours my last quarter in order to graduate. And so I'm leaving school. Maybe I should have headed straight. My initial inclination was to go to New York and immerse myself in the music business, but I took the simple route and went back home to Cleveland. And I'm figuring, well, I'm going to take a break here for a couple of weeks and whatnot. So but after a while, my dad was like, "Man, you got to get out here and get a job." And so I took a job, using my sociology degree. I took a job at the Ohio Adult Parole Authority. So I was a parole and probation officer. And I did that for a few years. But that particular work also enabled me to continue my writing. And there was no impediments as far as my writing and whatnot. And so, in my spare time, in my off hours, I continued to develop my writing and my interest in the music grew from there.
And how did you, because I know you've, in addition to your, work as a journalist and everything, you've also worked, heavily as a radio host. So how did you make that transition into radio as well?
Well, that happened at Kent State as well. Because a dear friend of mine named Michael Brown, he had a radio show. He had developed a radio show at the student radio station, which was and still is WKSU, which was an NPR affiliate. And he did a weekly radio show. And he had to leave that radio show, and he kind of bequeathed it to me. He introduced me to the station, and we talked, and they recognized that I had this interest and knowledge of the music. And so I began to do that radio program, which was a weekly 2-hour show called Exploration Jazz. And that was how I got into radio. I even did that radio program from Cleveland, commuting from Cleveland to do it on a weekly basis after postgraduate.
Mm-hmm.
And then other opportunities came up in Cleveland to do radio. I worked with a friend of mine to kind of develop a kind of a new release feature for the R&B station in Cleveland, the old R&B station in Cleveland, which was known as WABQ. And so we did these new release modules basically for WABQ, and that continued my radio efforts. And then in '84, when I moved to when I moved to take new work, moved to Minneapolis, to the Twin Cities. One of the first things I did was become affiliated with the community radio station in Minneapolis, KFAI. So I was doing weekly programs there. And so wherever I've been, that radio passion has always been there. But I always tell people, I've always worked for community and public radio stations and have never been a paid employee of any of these radio stations. It's always been volunteer radio. I've always looked at that as a valuable adjunct on the other things that I've been able to do in this music, and as a way of having a public voice on behalf of the music.
Mm-hmm. Well, and having a voice is very important to you. I mean, that's part of what Ain't But a Few of Us was kind of about, was talking about having that voice within the jazz community for your fellow people of color, because there ain't but a few of you. And so, can you talk about that, experience within the jazz world?
Well, as I continued on my travels, my journey as a jazz journalist, as that began to build, and as I began to build a certain credibility, which provided various opportunities to interview artists and to get to know artists and to get to know people at record companies and that kind of thing, I began to travel some as a traveling journalist. So, for example, I would get assignments to cover George Weah's various festivals in New York City, which started with the so-called Cool Jazz Festival, and then became the JVC Jazz Festival, and also eventually became Newport, New York Jazz Festival, because there was an incident at his old Newport Jazz Festival that caused that to be shut down for a couple of years before it was restarted by George Weah. And so he transferred his big festival production to New York City. And so I would get assignments from publications, either the Plain Dealer or other publications, to cover those big festivals in New York. And, that meant that I was working with the publicist of the festival to gain admission to the various performances that I wanted to cover. And invariably, when I would go to those performances, I would meet a lot of fellow journalists, including a lot of people that I had been reading down through the years. That's where I first had the opportunity to meet people like Leonard Feather and Dan Morgenstern and Ira Gidler and Martin Williams and some of the legendary writers on jazz. And while they were very encouraging and very collegial, it was never a matter of, oh, here's a young guy, we don't want to bother with him. No, it wasn't
Hmm.
like that. They were very welcoming. But I noticed, wow, you know, given the origins of this music we call jazz, it's curious that I'm the only black person here writing about the music. You know,
Yeah.
you might go backstage and to interview somebody after the concert, and other writers would be back there, and you recognize, why am I the only black person writing about this music or here covering this music?
Hmm.
So that planted a seed in my head, and then fast forward years later, starting in 2010, I developed an interview series on my. By this point, I had my own website.
Hmm.
I developed an interview series as part of my blog, where I sought out black writers on jazz, and including people that I had met, and then some who I was informed about later. And it was under the title of "Ain't But a Few of Us," because it's been interesting to me that there really haven't been in a relatively speaking, there haven't been a whole aggregate of African Americans writing about this music we call jazz, and you could that carries over also to the music industry in general. Uh,
Hmm.
there haven't been a whole lot of black writers uh, up until the advent of hip hop.
Hmm.
There hadn't been a whole lot of black writers covering a lot of this music. So that became a curiosity of mine, and I did this series of interviews, and the interviews went well. And it was never a matter of people griping or expressing their displeasure or at being shut out of various opportunities or anything like that. This was not a. These are not a series. It's not a series of aggrieved writers
Yeah.
expressing grievances. It's basically a series of writers expressing their journey and their how
Hmm.
they came to have bylines and to write about the music. And in some cases, along the way, matters of race intruded on their development as writers, and they talk about that. That's what
Hmm.
the basic premise of the book is.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing book, and especially as you said, for jazz, especially being such a deeply rooted in African American history, to come at it, that there is not as much perspective in the writing about it from an African American perspective. I think that's part of why your book is so important, is to capture some of that.
Well,
Uh,
ironically, I gotta say that um, as I was researching African Americans writing about jazz
mhm,
down through the years, um, and as I was reading these various publications like Downbeat magazine and the other magazines, uh, two of the people who were very important as far as early African American jazz writers were the late poet Amiri Baraka. He
mhm,
wrote extensively on jazz, and also the poet and still very much with us, A.B. Spellman. And
mhm.
so, ironically, here I am talking to you
Yeah.
uh, after being announced as a recipient of the 2024 A.B. Spellman NEA Jazz Masters Award for Advocacy. So, accepting this award in the name of A.B. Spellman is also very special because he's someone that I admired in my own development as a writer.
Mhm. Well, and that kind of segues perfectly into something I wanted to talk about, which is, what does winning this award mean to you?
Well, it's very humbling for one
Hmm.
thing, because I've followed this program, the NEA Jazz Masters program, from its inception in 1982. I've been to most of the subsequent NEA Jazz Masters Awards programs. I can remember when they first started having the actual awards programs. It was during the old IAJE, International Association of Jazz Educators conference.
Hmm.
It's the annual conference in New York in January. They began hosting these concert presentations of these awards. And so I've been an observer of this program. And 21 years ago, a man named Dana Gioia, who was the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, he wanted to expand the NEA Jazz Masters program, both in its reach and in terms of its visibility. And one of the things that he insisted on was that we needed to have a category for advocates. And previously, it had been
Hmm.
strictly musicians and singers who had been named NEA Jazz. And that's not to say singers aren't musicians, but I didn't want to say that. But it had been strictly musicians who had been named NEA
Hmm.
Jazz Masters up to that point about 21 years ago. And so they developed the Advocacy Award in the name of A.B. Spellman. And so that piqued my interest as well, because I was seeing fellow writers and whatnot accept these awards. And so here we come to 2023, and they call me and tell me that I had been selected. And so I was blown away. I've been on a cloud ever since.
Well, I can imagine, because there is no one more deserving of the award than you are. We are so
Well, thank
happy.
you, Adam.
We are so happy for you. We are so proud we get to work with you, not only on this show, but what the audience probably doesn't know is there's a couple programs behind the scenes that we're working on with Willard to eventually get out to the public one day, fingers crossed.
Right.
uh, that's actually working on one of those projects is how we first connected to Willard and the idea kind of came about to do the show. I remember is probably almost 2 years ago now, um, that we'd just gotten the Phil Shapp stuff,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and we had internally started going like, maybe we could do a trivia show and like the prizes would be the stuff from the collection or something. Like we were just trying to spitball some ideas, and then you called, and like I can't remember if you talked to me or I think you talked to Kent first and was like, "Hey, I used to do this portion on my show, radio show called Jazzology, and I was wondering if we could maybe." There was some way we could do that for something like that for Savage Content, and that got
Yeah.
my wheels spinning. And we talked, and so I kind of came up with a format, and that I thought would work for YouTube. And then we started doing test episodes, and I wouldn't let us stop until I felt we were ready. And here we are.
Here we are, 35 episodes later, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And it has been a great journey, and I can't wait to see what comes next. And the one thing I am looking forward to, because while it's been nearly 2 years and of working closely with you on this program and many other things, we have yet to meet in person. And
Yeah,
so,
right. Exactly. Exactly. Kent and I have had that pleasure.
yeah,
You and I have not.
yeah. So, well, if nothing else, maybe we can get you down here for All Without Words Live.
Let's do
Uh,
that.
you know, get you at least back into Ohio for a bit. And, Willard, just like everybody else, check out the, All Without Words Live to learn more about that. Willard, we can even send you a link and a passcode to the documentary that
Please
is
do.
connected to All Without Words that is yet to be publicly available. And to everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. We are at about 45 minutes. The time has just flown by, Willard. I think we could keep talking just about all day,
I
unfortunately.
think you probably could.
Well, and it was interesting. I was noticing, even though we are clearly very different people, different ages, different backgrounds, similarities. Your paternal grandfather was a Baptist minister. My maternal grandfather was a Lutheran minister in Ohio.
Okay.
you know, and just some other small similarities like that, where, it's like, no matter what, people are people. So,
That's right.
so thank you so much for, agreeing to take the
Well, thank
chance
you.
to let me interview you for this. We look forward to being back here next in 2 weeks at our regular time of 2:30 Fridays with Nathan and a challenger, and back to our regular format. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you everybody for all your support of Jazzology, of Savage Content, of Willard, and we'll talk to you guys soon. All right. Thanks
Take care.
everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.